Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film, and I'm very excited because today, as our special guest, we have author and director Joel Bakan. He's the director and writer of the film and book The Corporation, as well as a new book called The Childhood Under Siege, How Big Business Targets Your Children. Thank you very much, Joel, for coming on The Sounds of Film today.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
No problem. I'm very excited. I've wanted to speak to you for years. First off, if you don't mind, if we could spend a little bit of time going back and discussing your film and book, The Corporation. It's a work that shed light on the psychopathic nature of corporations. Through interviews and narration, you explained how corporations are legally obligated to seek profit at all costs, even if there are negative effects on society and individuals. I can say without a doubt that your movie completely made me and millions of others look at corporations in a completely new way. As a result, I now look at the presidential race, the news, and business in general in a more cynical way. The corporation raised so many interesting issues. I wanted to touch on just some of them that are raised in the film, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
All right. First of all, how did you come up with the whole concept? I know it was a while ago of the psychopath checklist that you compare corporations to in the book and in the film.
Well, I had done psychology as an undergraduate in college, and was introduced to psychopathology and psychopathy and all of those sorts of things as an undergraduate college student. And then when I was in law school and I was studying the corporation, and I learned from my corporate law professor that a corporation is a person deemed to be such by the law, and also that it is imbued with an operating principle known as the best interests of the corporation principle, which says that it always has to act in its own self-interest. And so I kind of put together my knowledge from my undergrad psychology courses and this notion of having a person that is constituted only to be able to act out of self-interest without concern for anybody else, without guilt or remorse for any things that may go wrong for other people. And I thought, wow, what we've created in the corporation is akin in every way to a human psychopath.
It's really pretty remarkable the way you lay it out in the book and in the film. And you do that through telling a variety of different stories. One of the interesting stories from the movie that really has always kind of stayed with me, I don't know if you remember this one, you interview a stockbroker, and he confesses that, like you said, always driven by profit, that even in events like 9/11 or war situations, that he admits that even in crisis types of situations, he's always thinking about, are his clients in gold? Are they going to be making money on the price of oil if there's a crisis and oil goes up? And I thought that was very, honest of him to admit that, but it was also a little disturbing.
Well, it's very disturbing, and it's very honest, and it's very truthful, that the only legitimate concern that a person can have when they have their hat on as a corporate executive or as a stockbroker is, how are my clients going to fare? That information that they have to process as quickly and competitively as they can, and as well as they can on behalf of their clients. If it's a corporate executive, their clients are their shareholders. And if it's a stockbroker, it's people who are in gold or thinking of selling gold or derivatives or futures. I mean, when you look at how things have unfolded in New Orleans after Katrina,
right,
or in Iraq after the war, I mean, the first people in, almost before, the first response emergency workers were corporations.
Yeah.
Ready to, run the school system in New Orleans, ready to make money, basically, in Halliburton in Iraq, for example, ready to make money by selling, packaged food products to soldiers or whatever. But from the corporate perspective, that's all that counts. And that is why I subtitled my book, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit, because that is disturbing, because it seems pathological. It seems out of sync with how we want to organize the way we make decisions as a society.
We're speaking with Joel Bakan, the author of Childhood Under Siege, How Big Business Targets Your Children and Also the Corporation. You're listening to The Sounds of Film. Going back to the corporation, there's one fascinating scene in the movie that I've watched over and over again. I've shown it to some of my students I teach, and it's about television and Fox News in particular. And there's a great story where you highlight a case, a pretty famous case, where a couple of Fox News reporters were trying to do a story about some of the problems that they found in the milk, and how they became whistleblowers, and it became this big case where they were trying to get their story on the air, but they were telling them that they couldn't because of some pressure from Monsanto, and so on and so on. And that whole story in itself was amazing. But the part that always haunts me is the last part of that segment in the film. You reveal that there's been a court decision that basically decided that the news does not have to be truthful. Can you tell us a little bit about that court case? Because I know you're very good with the law and explaining these things.
Yeah, I mean, there's no legal requirement that news actually be truthful. I mean, that is what that was what the reporters were attempting to argue. They were attempting to argue that they were protected as whistleblowers in part because Fox News had an obligation to convey truth, and that therefore their role in helping Fox News fulfill that obligation was basically protected. And the conclusion of the court was that their role wasn't really protected because there wasn't really that obligation. And again, it goes back, especially when you're operating in a context of heavy deregulation, of First Amendment concerns about governments not deciding what is or what isn't truthful. You end up with a situation where companies, news companies, media companies, are interested primarily in making profit. And that came through from that story as well. They make profit by creating a comfortable and a conducive environment for other corporations to place advertisements. That's the basic business model. And so when you combine that fact with the fact that there's no real oversight and there's no real legal obligation to be truthful, you have a scenario where you're going to end up with the kind of news, I guess, that we have today, and the kind of news environment that we have today, where accuracy, where truth isn't really the product that we're getting.
That segment of the film was, I think, particularly well done, the way it was edited and put together. And then when you hit with that realization at the end that the truth doesn't matter, you walk away just blown away. One other story that's mentioned in The Corporation, which was total news to me, and I think people have to hear about this if they haven't seen The Corporation yet, is the story that you did about patents and the idea that there were some significant court cases and appeals where I think it was GE had tried to patent some kind of organism, and at first they couldn't because I guess there were limitations in terms of having a patent on life.
Yeah.
But then that was changed, and to me this was almost like sci-fi. Like
Yeah.
I was like, where are we heading with this stuff? That was the most haunting part of the entire movie, because if you take everything else that you make the case for, and then you try to think about in the future if corporations can start to have ownership of life and genetics and things like that. I mean, that was a really amazing segment of the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely scary, and it's scary in a sci-fi way when you combine the profit principle with the sort of liberal nature of patent law in terms of defining what an invention is, and that's what it comes down to, and that's what we were trying to get at in that segment of the film, is that the idea today in patent law is that an invention includes some kind of a life form that's been altered. So that if you take a mouse and you genetically modify that mouse, that mouse now is an invention. And so the idea is it's no longer an invention of nature, but it's a human artifact. It's a human invention. It's a life form, but it's an invention of human beings. And therefore it's something whose commercial potential can be effectively owned, which is what you do when you patent something. And that is a scary idea, especially as we look at, where biotechnology is going. And you don't have to be a sort of sci-fi writer or even all that imaginative to see what the possibilities are in terms of cloning,
right?
In terms of altering, various kinds of life forms. And ultimately, of course, the scariest part is humans. And
right.
you think about the clones in Star Wars or something like that.
Yeah.
And the problem, of course, is that when you have laws like that, science isn't some kind of an enterprise that just goes in accordance with natural principles. It's an enterprise that sort of is channeled in accordance with incentives. And if the law is such that you can own life forms if you alter them, then that incentivizes scientific research to do that. And it makes it more likely that we move in that sci-fi direction, because now there's money to be made from doing that. Whereas if we didn't have that law, science would move in a different direction. Not necessarily in that direction, not necessarily as quickly. But right now we've, in effect, through our patent laws, we've incentivized that kind of sort of scary direction of altering life forms.
I love the shot in the film where there's a camera panning back through, I guess, what's supposed to be like a patent office or something like that, and you just see all these files giving sort of the implication that right now there's scientists all over the world making slight adjustments to all different life forms,
yeah.
and that they're putting patents on this stuff, and who knows where this is going to lead.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
It's definitely scary. I mean, as we're talking, it brings me back fondly to the shooting and editing and writing and everything else of that film. But I also have to say what an abject failure the film was. I mean, it played around the world. It won all these awards. It made some money. But look at our world today. I mean, the trends that it was identifying and revealing have only gotten worse. They've only deepened. And my main reason for being in the business of writing and analyzing is to try to change things. And I look at it and I say, wow, Tom sort of says that his consciousness was raised by it, and it's caused him to look at things differently. And I hear from people every day about how much it changed their life and stuff. But our world is profoundly more corporatized than it was even when we were making that film. And everything that we talked about seems worse than it was when we were making it. In fact, Mark and I are talking about a sequel now for those very reasons.
Well, I think it's needed more so than ever. I mean, you were really ahead of your time. I'm sure you've done other interviews about this, but who would have ever guessed, that there would be Occupy Wall Street and all that kind of stuff? And a lot of people were sort of confused, or at least in the mainstream press, they tried to make it seem like, why are people protesting on Wall Street? Why are they not in Washington and stuff like that? But to anybody who saw The Corporation or who read The Shock Doctrine or, similar works, people have seen this coming for some time, and I think you were ahead of the game. I think you woke up a lot of people with this film. It really is a remarkable work. I often, I talk about a lot of different films, not all of them are documentaries, but I always put The Corporation in my top 3 films.
Oh, that's great.
Because I
think... As I say, I wish it had more of an effect on the world. I wish that I was able to say, oh, gee, we were wrong in being as skeptical as we were, But anyways, there you go.
That was one of your first films, correct?
That was my first film. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a law professor.
Right, no, I know. Yeah. So I was wondering how...
But I want to make another. I mean, I wanted to do one out of Childhood Under Siege, but then, I don't know, events like Occupy Wall Street, the 2008 crisis, it just seems to me that another, I mean, if Pirates of the Caribbean can have 3 or 4 different sequels, I don't see why we can't have one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a market for it, and I think this thing could really take off. I mean, there's definitely a market for documentaries, and I think, from people that are into documentaries, this film, I mean, you can't mention it to anyone, and they're not, aware of this movie. It's a remarkable thing. I do want to move on to your new book, because your new book is really fabulous. I really enjoyed it, and it has some incredible information in it. But I did want to ask you one last thing about the corporation, if we can. One bit of U.S. history that I have to admit that I was unaware of, and then since the movie's come out, I've seen several people bring up this little bit of history, including Jesse Ventura, of all people, wrote about it in his book. But it's the incredible story about General Smedley Butler.
Right.
And maybe for our listeners who don't know the story, can you kind of just kind of summarize what the story is all about and why you included it?
There's this highly decorated Marine general named Smedley Butler. He's won the Congressional Medal of Valor. I mean, he's as good as it gets in the military. Trained at West Point, the whole deal. And he's one of the people who's leading troops in various trouble spots in the American Empire in the sort of first third of the 20th century. Doing work in Central America and South America, in China to some extent, especially where there are major oil interests and major agricultural interests, Dole Pineapple and all the other big companies that were expanding their domains into those countries. And often the U.S. Army would help that expansion, by suppressing revolutions and putting puppet dictators in place and all that kind of stuff. And so he was involved in all of that. And he kind of reached the conclusion as a result of that, and went public about it, that, as he put it, he thought that the U.S. Government, was much more effective than Al Capone in running these kind of criminal, muscle-driven empires, economic empires. And so he was very, very honest, and very. It was a real, I think, revelation and epiphany for him. He kind of woke up one morning and saw all the stuff that he'd been involved in a very different light, in a very negative light. Now, a group of people, a group of corporate leaders, seemed not to be aware of the fact that he had had this conversion, and because he was quite popular with veterans in the early 1930s, because he had been a big advocate for veterans' rights, they thought that perhaps in the United States we could go a similar route to that in Italy and in Germany, where veterans' armies were put together in part to help support fascist coups, and so they approached Smedley Butler with this plan and basically asked him to lead and organize a coup to overthrow Roosevelt, because they saw Roosevelt as anti-business for a variety of reasons. He'd abandoned the gold standard. He was bringing in, regulation of corporations, of capitals, of Wall Street, and he was seen as a real threat to American capitalism. And so this group of this cabal of corporate leaders approached Smedley Butler and basically asked him to lead a coup and effectively become the fascist leader of the United States. And he played them along for a while, and then he went to the House Un-American Activities Committee, which later became notorious under Joseph Carthy for pursuing communists, but its original mandate was to pursue fascists as well as communists. And he went to them and he told all, and he named names and did everything, and they accepted that everything he said was true, and they accepted that everything had happened, and they issued a report, but they refused to actually name names in the report. But
why was no one prosecuted?
And I think it had to do with the real politic of what was going on. I mean, not only was no one prosecuted, no one was even named.
Right.
And I guess part of it was that there was only that one witness, and part of it was that the people involved had kind of covered their tracks, and there were various layers of people in the middle between the real higher ups and the folks who actually approached Smedley. So I think the real problem is that there was no smoking gun evidence that these people from Goodyear Tire and the DuPont brothers and the others who were alleged to be involved in it, there was no smoking gun evidence that could draw an absolute link to them. So that's probably why no litigation came out of it, because obviously it's treasonous behavior.
Right.
So it's quite an episode, and I mean you don't find it in most 11th grade American history textbooks.
It really is a remarkable story, and I've shown it to so many different people, and I watch it, and you watch it, and you almost feel like, well, that's pretty amazing. I don't know if that really happened.
Yeah,
it just doesn't seem like it's possible.
I know. I wanted to do a feature film actually of it, and got as far as sort of finding out if I could get the rights to the book that was written by Jules Archer called "The Plot to Seize the White House."
Wow.
That's the main work out there that tells the story in its entirety, and I wanted to get the rights to make a film from that book, but it turned out somebody has those rights, and it's just sitting on them. So that's unfortunate, because it'd make a great Hollywood film.
Do you get the sense that someone's holding on to it to make the film, or are they holding on to it so no one makes the film?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I believe most of these things happen out of sort of laziness and neglect. So I think it's probably not that they're trying to sit on the story. It's just, nothing's getting done.
Gotcha.
But it is. I mean, it's just an incredible story. It'd be such an amazing film if it were done properly.
It really would, and I mean, I'm sure you know the role that it serves in terms of the movie, but for many people, I think, the fact that you save it towards the end of the movie is really very powerful, because you build up all this information about the nature of the corporation, you give us all these different examples, and you wonder where this could go, and it's amazing that so far back, even before corporations were as powerful as they are today, they're probably more powerful today, that this event actually happened, that there could be heads of CEOs who today we celebrate, and we have business channels, and they're on the cover of Wall Street Journal.
Too.
And it's amazing that this could actually happen. And I don't think anyone would believe it. And it makes you wonder, what is actually going on. I mean, you read in books like Confessions of an Economic Hitman and stuff like that. Like, stuff goes on in third world countries and stuff like that, but it's amazing that something like that could happen here, and it kind of wakes people up.
Well, and then, the other more sinister way of looking at it is that it's effectively happened.
Right, I know.
There's that great film, which you may know of, I think it was a BBC miniseries called The Very British Coup.
Right.
About a real sort of firebrand socialist gets elected, and just the way he's undone. And it just feels like, well, what if Obama had actually really done the kinds of things that many of the people who elected him wanted him to do?
Right.
But he have gotten away with it.
Well, I have to say, though, kind of alluded to it earlier, the movie The Corporation has really ruined so much for me, because whenever I hear something like, for example, when Obama was elected, very quickly you got to hear the information about how he was one of the most corporate-funded presidents ever. Yeah. And more, Goldman Sachs was, funding his campaign and so forth. And then I'm just like, I think about the corporation, and I'm like, what does that mean? If all these people are supporting him, can he really be promising to do the things that he's saying? You hope so, but it just doesn't seem, after watching this film and reading the book, it doesn't seem possible.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I can't dispel you of that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, in any case, we're speaking with Joel Bakan, the award-winning film director and author of The Corporation, and he has a brand new work out, which I'm equally excited about. It's called Childhood Under Siege: How Big Business Targets Your Children. Now, in The Corporation, you did have a segment on how advertisers target children, and that was pretty interesting, but you really get into it in a lot more detail in this book. And it's an important work. I mean, everyone kind of recognizes, leaders all over the world have, and authors have always recognized that if you really want to affect a society, you get to the children first. And now you see it more so than ever. And you really cover this material quite well in this book. You cover a lot of different areas. If we could just touch on a couple of them. One of the areas that I'm most interested in, because I also teach besides doing this, is that you seem to be indicating that big business has a great desire to get their hands on the public school system. You had mentioned Katrina, and I'm sure you're aware of how, once Katrina did all the damage, one of the first things that businesses did is they just went in there and they took over the entire school system and put in charter schools. And that there's this major movement all over America and all around the world right now to privatize schools. And you get into even more than just privatization of schools, but the whole idea of what the content will be in schools in the future. And can you just comment on that a little bit? I found it fascinating.
I mean, I think there's no question that, there are several things that there are no question about. One is that education is a huge potential moneymaker for big business. It's something that historically has been in the public sector, and like other things that business would like to get their hands on. I mean, prisons is an example where this has happened. Something historically in the public sector that is a potential moneymaker, and so companies get into running it. Education is the same. I mean, in doing The Corporation way back then, we spoke with Benno Schmidt Jr., who was one of the people who helped get Edison Schools running, which is one of the large EMOs, education management organizations, that runs public schools on a for-profit basis. And, he said that there is no area of the American economy other than healthcare that as large as education in terms of a place where industry can operate to make money.
Wow.
I mean, kids are in school 5 hours a day, and there are many, many kids, and they're in school for 12 years of their lives. And when you add that all up, if you're delivering that, let's say, just hypothetically, on a completely for-profit basis, so your schools are run for-profit, your teachers are trained for-profit, your food services, bus services, janitorial services, all of that's for-profit. Your buildings are built, they're run for-profit. It's an incredible amount of money. And basically, as Benno Schmidt said, other than healthcare, it's the largest potential moneymaker. Now, if that's the case, you can be sure that business is going to be pushing to get a piece of it. And they are, like crazy. There are too many examples to talk about. I talk about some of them in my book. But basically, there is a move in terms of lobbying, in terms of the public policy agenda around education, in terms of luminaries like Bill Gates and other major philanthropists working on the issue, all pushing in the same direction. And the direction says something like this: our schools are broken. They are not producing students who can compete in a globalized 21st century economy. We need more math, we need more science, and this is the important part, we need schools to run more like businesses, and we need more schools run by businesses. And we need schools that inculcate business values, that have partnerships with businesses, and so on and so forth. And you get that all the way across the education debate. You get it. It's the animating idea behind Obama's race to the top.
Right.
His education minister, Arnie Duncan, oversaw the corporatization and commercialization of the Chicago School District before he was appointed to be education minister. So this is the prevailing idea. It's being pushed very hard. It's being pushed with very deep pockets. And it is, I utilitarian notions that underlay it, to the notion that every kid should get a mind-broadening education that helps them not only, in the workforce, but also helps them become citizens in a democracy. I mean, all those ideas are just out the window. Nobody talks about them anymore. What people talk about is how do we prepare them for the 21st century. And
right.
So you get in inner cities, you get an almost entire complete giving up on the idea of liberal education, and you get these new career academies where high schools are oriented to train kids for basically low-level, low-wage jobs, and don't really aspire to do much more than that. And so that's kind of the direction in which things are going, and I think it's a very dangerous direction if we care at all about democracy, if we care at all about sort of, any kind of humanistic ideals about what we're supposed to be doing on this earth and how we find meaning and how we find purpose in life. It's just a very utilitarian model, and it's driven by business in terms of both business wanting the education system to train workers for them, and also business wanting to be involved in making profit through the education system. So for both of those dynamics are pressuring very hard notions of liberal education.
Well, I think you explained that really well. And what's so sad about it is that people, I think in general, just don't see what you just described. I mean, people, unfortunately, really do get involved in the whole debate about how can we save our troubled schools and all that kind of stuff, and defeat those teacher unions and things like that. And unfortunately, it's such a tough topic for people to see that there isn't some validity in what they're saying, because people, do have opinions about, things that are wrong with the school system and so forth. So it's very easy to get people, to think that something has to change, because obviously there's changes that need to occur.
Question. I mean, there is no question that there needs to be change. The system isn't working, especially for kids who live in poor, racialized communities.
Right.
Not working. And it's very easy, especially when the mass media, when all of these lobby groups and public opinion groups funded by the likes of Bill Gates are using reports on how, and Hollywood's making films. There's just one out now.
It's unbelievable.
About how unions are obstructionist, and how they're just, how all they care about is teachers' self-interest and not the kids. And I mean, there's a whole ideological claptrap out there. I mean, let me give you an example of what would change things a great deal. I'm a dual citizen. I'm both Canadian and American, and I live in Canada. In Canada, schools are funded not on the basis of local property taxes, but on the basis of general revenues, tax revenues. And so what that means is that there's no real difference in how much a school gets funded in a poor neighborhood versus how much it gets funded in the wealthiest neighborhood.
Right.
And so we don't have an inner city school problem in the way that the United States does. And it's not because of teachers' unions or greed. It's not because of any of that. It's because of a tax policy.
Right.
And the problem with the American debate is it's villainizing teachers, when the real problem is that the policy/tax situation is set up in a way that creates context in which it's impossible for teachers to teach, and it's impossible for students to learn. I mean, when you've got broken down furniture, buildings that don't work, violence in the hallways, kids coming to school having not eaten, on drugs, all the problems associated with poverty, with underfunded schools. You can be the most amazing teacher in the world, and in fact, in my book I talk about one such amazing teacher, my Aunt Ellie, who taught in Brooklyn. But it doesn't matter. I mean, if those are the conditions in which you're teaching, there's not much you can do as a teacher, and yet the teachers get blamed, and what happens is the debate gets just totally
Exactly. There's no one debating at all, really, hardly on a mass scale, the whole idea of privatization.
Yeah,
That's just not even the discussion. It's like you said, it just gets into some of the more obvious arguments that people usually get into about education. It's kind of depressing.
yeah, it is.
One or the other, I'm sorry, because we only have limited time, and there's so much good stuff. We're speaking with Joel Bakan. You're listening to The Sounds of Film. He's a director and writer of The Corporation, and also a brand new book that's amazing called The Childhood Under Siege, How Big Business Targets Your Children. And you talk about so many different areas. It's unbelievable where corporations are trying to take over different industries and direct these industries towards profit in the area where it affects kids. And one of the major parts of the book, which I was blown away by, was you're writing about the pharmaceutical industry. What do you see, really quickly, to be the most central problems that exist in terms of the way that corporations are targeting kids when it comes to drugs?
I think the most central problem has to do with the production and dissemination of research. And I talk about it at great length in the book, but the bottom line is that there needs to be some kind of a separation of medical research, and in this case pharmaceutical research concerning children's mental disorders, mental health problems, and industry interests. There needs to be a separation because the pharmaceutical industry has a conflict of interest. Their interest is in producing more diseases, more disorders that can be treated by more drugs. And that, that is objectively their interest. That's not a charge against them. That's just what they're supposed to do. That's how you make money as a pharmaceutical corporation. You sell drugs. So obviously you have an interest in having larger, expanded markets. And so if you're in control of the research that's done on drugs and on mental disorders, and if you're in control of how that research is disseminated to doctors, to parents, to the public, if you're in control of all that, you're in control of a lot that can help you create larger markets. And so when we look at the fact that there's been an eightfold increase since 1993 in the amount of psychotropic drugs being prescribed to children, that's an 800% increase. When we look at that, we have to ask, well, is some of that maybe a result of this problem, this conflict of interest, this incentive for industry to create more disorders that can be treated by more drugs? And my answer is, I don't know what the number is. I don't know how many more prescriptions are a result of that. But I think just as a matter of common sense and analysis, we can say that probably some significant portion of it is somehow related to that. And there are many people saying that. And so the solution, I think, is to try to go back to a system, because we used to have one, where we kind of have a wall between commercial interests and medical research.
That's interesting. I was just actually watching an old interview with Huxley, the author of The Brave New World, and it was an old interview with Mike Wallace, and he really predicted that in the future that that huge percentages of the population would be taking antidepressants and other types of drugs, and it seems to be happening. He didn't get into the whole profit motive of it the way that you do, but he did predict it, and it is coming true, and it's a pretty amazing thing. Could you also talk a little bit about, before we wrap this up, about child labor and some of the things that you discovered in doing this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the really, again, notable but not noteworthy but not sufficiently noted stories is the hundreds of thousands of kids, mainly immigrant kids, who work in really dangerous, difficult, exploitative conditions in the agricultural industry in the United States. And so that's something I talk about, the fact that the law basically says that it's okay to work in the agricultural industry at the age of 12, when for other areas of the economy it's 14 and up. So there's this big exemption that's created for farms, which are mainly operate a whole movement afoot, which is what I talk about in that chapter, of kind of moving back to a world where it's okay for children to work in jobs that aren't necessarily good for them. And so that's kind of my argument in the book. It's not that a kid should never work. I mean, I told my 12-year-old kid to go out and cut the grass and paper roots, and this is. But the big question, I think, the way we look at it as a society, is that if kids are working, there should be something. It should be mainly for them. I mean, we don't want to exploit their labor in order to make profit, but really, to the extent they're working, the standard should be: does that job help them in some way? Does it inculcate, values and responsibility and skills and all of that? And that's certainly not what's happening on farms across the United States, with very, very poor kids working in very lousy conditions at very low wages to help farmers make profit, and with no real benefit to them other than the fact it helps them to survive financially. So, anyways, that's what I talk about in that chapter.
Well, that stuff is pretty shocking, and it's really powerful. And I think that there's a lot of people that, if you don't live in that area of the country, you're probably oblivious to the fact that it's even going on. So I think...
Although it is going on in New York State as well. I mean, it's not just the Southwest.
Wow.
You have, there are migrant workers, and usually where there are migrant workers, there are going to be child workers as well, working on farms across the country, really anywhere where there's agriculture. It's likely that will be going on. So obviously it's more prevalent in the southwestern U.S.
Joel, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but we kind of have to wrap this up. We've been speaking with Joel Bakan. He's the writer and director of The Corporation, and also a brand new book called The Childhood Under Siege: How Big Business Targets Your Children. Joel, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program, and I think the work that you're doing is pretty important and remarkable, and I'm excited to hear firsthand from you that there might be a corporation too. I'm really excited to hear about that possibility, and I'd love to talk to you again. I think that you have an insight that you've kind of come across in doing this research that you've done that's pretty unique, but it's a message that I think more and more people are catching on to about the role of the corporation and children's lives and everyone's lives, and how it's really just changing the society that we live in. I mean, too many people get their news, I think, from people like Thomas Friedman, who kind of champions globalization and all that kind of stuff and says that we just have to adapt to it. But you paint a much darker picture where people have to really understand what the consequences of this world that we're moving towards and are actually already living in. And you do such a remarkable job of really kind of explaining it at a level that I think a lot of people can understand.
Well, most importantly, too, we do have choices. I mean, I'm ultimately optimistic about us as human beings.
Right.
This isn't being done to us. We are, in part, doing it, and we can do it differently.
Well, thank you very much, Joel. And once again, his current book is Childhood Under Siege: How Big Business Targets Your Children. I recommend it. And if you've never seen the movie or read the book, The Corporation, also check that out. Joel, thanks so much for coming on The Sounds of Film.
Thanks, Tom. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.